So you've got a new competitor in town. No, it's not those pesky landlords, Bob and Mary. It's someone much bigger, and they've got much deeper pockets. Should you be afraid? Or actually weirdly optimistic?
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning, property investors come to be informed and inspired. This week, we're continuing last week's conversation about build to rent and giving you an insight into what its future looks like and what that means for you. And make sure you stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we're recommending another podcast that you should definitely be listening to.
Okay, so for our news story of the week, this is possibly my favourite headline of the year so far. And it reads, and it's from The Guardian, "Welcome to Manhattan, how the city sold its soul for luxury skyscrapers." And this is an article by The Guardian, as I've said, which talks about Manchester, but Manhattan, Rob. Genius. I don't know if they came up with it, but I'd not heard of that before. But obviously from the title, it's not complimentary to the city or what it's doing.
No, I do love the headline. I also love the caption where there's a photo of Axis Tower, Beetham Tower, Deansgate, all looking beautiful. And the headline is truly shameful. And in the first paragraph, it suggests that it might be described as hell upon earth, which is quite dramatic.
They'd obviously not been to Rill. Sorry for all listeners in Rill.
We're working our way through the country, offending everyone. But
I can never go there again.
But basically, it's talking about all the skyscrapers that are appearing. And in the subheading, it says, how will this help the city's rocketing homelessness problem? And my answer to that would be, well, having thousands of extra people paying high rates of council tax probably will allow you to raise money to do more than you could do when it was just a bit of scrubland and a car park. But that's clearly not the angle that The Guardian is taking. They seem to see this trend of people living in the city centre as purely negative. But as we've talked about extensively this year, Rob, this trend towards city centre living is happening, whether The Guardian likes it or not, and there will be adjustments that need to be made as a result.
Yeah, I really struggle with The Guardian on this one. I think it's a good newspaper, but how they've allowed this piece of journalism to be printed is beyond me. Investment into a city, I really struggle to see why that can be deemed as a negative. It regenerates that whole area, and that area was, as you've said, Rob, scrubland and car parks. Nothing particularly nice about that particular part of town. And now it's beautiful. And now not only beautiful from, to look at, and wow, I think this city is really impressive, but also on ground level, all the facilities that are being built there, all the retail units, again, just uplifts the city. And another thing the Guardians failed to touch on here is the contributions that these developers would have had to make to the city through something called Section 106, which basically is a contribution you have to make to the local authority. They have handed over millions of pounds between them. Now, it's then up to the local authority to decide how that money is spent, but that money can go directly to the homeless if desired. Manchester, like other cities, absolutely does have a homeless problem, and it absolutely should be addressed. But to make the leap that it's caused by or contributed by these developments is just mind-blowing. So, Manhattan, wonderful. Rest of the article, garbage.
This week, we're bringing you the second part of our interview with the UK's leading build-to-rent expert, Richard Berridge. In last week's episode, we covered with Richard what build-to-rent actually is. And this week, we're talking about why it matters for you and what the future of build-to-rent might look like. So if we're looking at the industry in 10 years' time, at the moment it's the vast majority, city centre, younger people, all the amenities, that sort of thing. In 10 years' time, do you think it will still be predominantly that, or will it look a lot broader?
Well, I think it will be principally because most of the focus is there now. And of course, giving the sort of lead-in times to get these things up and going in 10 years' time, some of them will only have been brought to fruition 5 years beforehand, or even probably less in some ways, depending on how big the scheme is, and and if it's part of a wider regen scheme or some of that sort of stuff. So yeah, generally speaking, it is going to be doing that. Having said that, build to rent itself has not stood still in terms of a single product. It's diversifying in a number of ways. It's looking at, say, later living, which is a build to rent product for older people who want to either downsize or get rid of their assets and just be more flexible, with again another sort of associated element of amenity associated with older people. So you might start to see an element of care come into that. It won't be a care home per se, that sort of stuff, I think, but it'll be more focused on that. And then you're looking at people who are looking to mix communities with later living and build to rent and co-living and other sorts of stuff coming through. And then, of course, as we've discussed, that there's houses as well, which has been sort of completely overlooked. It's a product which is, in my view, probably a better investment proposition in many ways, but it doesn't have the immediacy of scale that big blocks of flats do. So that will take longer to come through, and that will be down to smaller funds who will over time build up a portfolio of investable quality, which eventually will get sold to institutions over time, but that will probably take 5 to 7 years to get any sort of traction and maturity.
What's going to be the constraint to the growth of the sector? It feels like there's lots of cash flowing around and lots of enthusiasm. What's going to, if anything, going to slow it down?
Well, I just kind of think sort of it's like anything in nature, you reach a quantum point, and so who knows where that's going to be. I mean, if Knight Frank are right, and it's going to be 70 billion pounds by 2025. It's difficult to see how many homes that will be. I suppose if you divide it by 200, you just get your answer. But will it become a substantial part of the PRS? Well, it's got some way to go to get to 5% of the private rental sector even now. So, which means that if in say by 2025 it's at say 5 to 7%, it's still small beer. So where's it going to go? Is it going to be directly in competition with buy-to-let? Yes, it is, after a fashion, and as build-to-rent comes in more and it starts to diversify, to talk about later living, start doing with houses, starts to more co-living and that sort of stuff, then it's obviously going to offer greater choice. A lot of it's going to depend on how the private buy-to-let investor market responds to where it is right now, I guess, in many ways. Will it fill, and it also depends how quickly the buy-to-let, if it does at all, market retrenches. Will it be able to fill that space that the buy-to-let market leaves quickly? At the moment, no, it's not possible to build as quickly as perhaps you can retrench. So, I mean, it's a bit of a sort of $60,000 question, really. It's a hard one to answer. I mean, I think that it will continue to grow quite strongly. And it will become, as I said, it will diversify. It will start moving away from, intensely urban areas, from real strong conurbations like Liverpool and Manchester and Leeds and Birmingham, that sort of stuff. And it'll start to look at slightly smaller areas, slightly smaller. I mean, for instance, Plymouth is a great city, for instance, but the metrics don't work there for me because the values aren't there. Basic values don't work there. And I think, I think there's a sort of fundamental metric that if something is worth less than, on a rental terms per annum, £15 a square foot, then it's very difficult to make it work as a proposition. But as modular construction comes in, as rents rise, as technology moves on, as the sector evolves, we'll start to look at places like Plymouth that do need really good, rental schemes becoming more viable. So we'll see. But I think it will continue to grow.
It's interesting because if it's going to grow, it has to take. If it's going to grow, it has to take market share from somewhere. So is it going to take it from buy-to-let, or is it going to take it from owner-occupiers? Like, people going to think, well, God, this is all a bit of a hassle, having to clear out my own gutters, and the kind of that ingrained part of the psyche is going to soften a little bit.
Well, it's never a simple answer, is it? Because the thing is that things are always more holistic than you like to think. You always like to think that, you've done your research, and that, based on a bit of research about maybe retrenchment from buy-to-let, that you can fill that gap and that's it. But life's never as simple as that. There's a whole range of factors that come into play to either promote growth or restrict growth, and you're never quite sure. I mean, the economy could change substantially. I mean, a whole range of things could happen. So I don't like to think that it's going to take market from anyone or others. I like to think in many ways that the buy-to-let market is responding positively to the challenges that the build-to-rent market is presenting them with, particularly around customer experience. And I think one of the things that I used to say to any of my friends who have got buy-to-let investments themselves, and I think it's the strongest thing I can always say to anybody, because people give you loads of advice about investments and doing this and funding it this way or the other, but for me, I would always say that it might be your asset, but it's their home. You must always approach your tenant as if it's their home, because it's very easy to get very territorial about the things that you own and saying, well, this person's in this and it's doing this to my house and it's my. But really, yes, it is yours, but it is someone else's home. If you can get to the point where you recognize that the person who's renting from you, it's their home. And if you were to, and anything that impinges upon home is something that's sort of quite psychologically sort of, impressive in the sense that, if you were to just say, for instance, like many landlords do, just suddenly walk in on somebody because you have a key because you're a landlord. You can't do that on someone's home. All these things, and I think we're gradually sort of getting rid of the person who is very territorial about their asset, who seems to view the tenant as a sort of a bit of an interloper, who's there in a bit of a pain in the arse, and always asking for things, if it wasn't for the rent, I wouldn't be doing this sort of stuff. And once you start to treat them like the build-to-rent guys do, as sort of customers, if you like, as people whose very existence you want to enhance, then you get a much easier ride from those people. I mean, it's just exponential how much easier it is to deal with people who are enjoying life, living in a home. They might not own it, it might be your asset, but it's their home.
I think the majority of listeners to this podcast are probably earlier on in sort of their experiences with property. So rather than having been people who've been in the game for 20, 30 years and starting to get out, these are people who are coming into it now, so like with the tax changes already in place. So they're not going to be scared off by any of that. But how should they feel about build to rent? Should they be adapting in any way to these institutions, or should they be avoiding certain types of investment if they can have their toes trodden on?
Well, I wouldn't. Well, clearly, I wouldn't have an investment. I'd probably sort of move away slightly from intensely urban investments where the competition is going to be all about amenity, because obviously, it's like having the latest Nikes, isn't it? I mean, tenants are notoriously fickle in many ways, and that's one of the sort of things that build-to-rent guys are sort of slightly concerned about, is the fact that they sort of leased up and are stabilised and have been for 3 years, and a new block goes up opposite to them, and they go, what are we going to do? So that's why the sort of customer experience thing comes in. In terms of sort of new people coming in, there are plenty of tenants out there who don't want to live in a huge block of flats. They kind of want to live in a conversion or something like that, or in a block or a flat where you have a more, maybe you might have a more intimate relationship with the landlord, in the sense that you can sort of call them up and do that sort of stuff. It's still a professional relationship, but there are also quite a lot of sort of prop tech solutions out there that sort of landlords can buy into, which can help, replicate, if it's for want of a better phrase, a similar sort of feeling to build to rent. And there's like custom engagement tools like Vabu, for instance. I mean, these guys basically have a tool which is like a rewards in many ways. It's fundamentally an engagement tool, so they get to engage with their landlord or with their agent, all the time. But at the same time, they get kind of rewards coming through, a bit like, I suppose the guys from Vabu would hate me for saying this, but a bit like Wowcher or something like that. You're always getting stuff coming through. But what you are doing is continually engaging with your tenant, and you're speaking to them, and you're creating a line of communication, which means that you're open at all times, not just to listen to any maybe problems that they might have, but to have any sort of engagement, because it's a bit like block manager. I speak to block managers sometimes, and I talk to them about sort of getting into build to rent because of their asset management experience. And fundamentally, the poor old block management people only ever get to hear or speak to the lessees when they're sending them a bill for something. And that's not really the greatest experience in life. Is the next time I hear from my managing agent is when he sends me my service charge bill or my ground rent bill, or tells me that the roof needs to be done, or that you're going to be changing all the windows to double glazing and it's going to cost me a fortune.
I get that whenever an envelope comes in the post with that logo of one of the management companies on it, it's never something good. It's always something that's going to cost money in some way.
No, so you've got to sort of create sort of positive engagement with people, and that's can cost you nothing in many ways. It's just thinking about it in a different way. And I would never put anybody off wanting to get involved in building an asset for themselves over time. And let's face it, if we want to be a more mobile society in the future, and rent a lot more, our first asset, in fact our only asset, may not be the asset that we're going to live in. It might be the asset that we're going to retire to, or have in the future. And we may continue to enjoy our lifetime of experiences and flexibility, and and not having the responsibility of looking after our home and the anchor that it sets around us because we can't move, because we do that sort of stuff, and have all the things that we want. But at the end of the day, we can still have an asset there that's performing for us potentially better than, say, having a pension. So, or put it into SIPs, all sort of stuff that we will enjoy in later life. So when people say to me, what's going to happen to the sort of renting community when they sort of get to 60 and they've got no assets? And I say, well, they may well have assets. They'll just be garnering them in a different way. And those assets, instead of having to pay a mortgage and you're working for them, those mortgages may well be paid for by other tenants. It's pretty simple. I mean, I would always encourage someone to go and invest.
We don't know what property is going to do in terms of values or anything year to year, but the one thing we do know is it's cyclical, that at some point it will crash horrendously. How will that affect build to rent?
Interesting question. It's a lovely question to have, really, because the great thing about rental is that in a really difficult purchasing environment, when the economy goes completely, people still have to have somewhere to live, and that tends to be somewhere to rent. And rental levels do not tend to dive during recessions that much, and if they do, it tends to remain pretty static. And it's going to make build to rent even more important, and it's not going to affect it in the sense there'll probably be reduced rental growth for a period of time during whatever however long or deep that recession is. But on the whole, the great thing about renting, doesn't matter actually whether it's built to rent or buy to let in many ways, is that it offers a refuge to those people who do not want to commit to anything because the environment is just too uncertain. And so rental tends to be a much better option. And so whether it's buy to let or build to rent, it sort of doesn't really affect it very much, apart from the fact that the income levels or the rental levels might not be quite as high. But apart from that, it's a pretty good refuge.
So thank you once again, Richard, for enlightening us with your knowledge and also getting us excited by the future of build to rent. Now, you may be listening going, excited? Wait, surely this is our competition. This is a threat. And I am an optimist by nature, but I think build to rent is a good thing, not just for tenants, but actually for property as a whole. And I know, Rob, that's going to sound a strange thing, but we've seen this play out on a smaller scale before with students and student housing, and that has had a positive effect. However, it is important to understand, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, screw you, Rob and Rob, I think this is awful, is that the student market is a lot smaller than the overall buy-to-let market. The buy-to-let market is huge, and build-to-rent impact is definitely there, but it will take a long time for this to play out. In city centres, it'll happen first, and they may spread their wings and look out to other areas as well. But this is going to be very gradual, so you don't need to rip up your portfolio or go and refurb every single property to a 5-star standard overnight. But you just need to have this in mind. And that's why we wanted to do this podcast, is to keep you aware of what's happening in the market, to help keep you a few steps ahead, not just of build to rent, but actually other investors and landlords who are out there who don't take the time to build on their knowledge like you are by listening to this. The fact that you are aware of this now means that you can slowly, in time, take action.
Yeah, we've talked a lot over the last few years about the professionalisation of buy-to-let and the housing sector in general. And that's an inevitable trend that you cannot resist. People who've not embraced that trend have ended up with unlettable properties because they've started to look so much worse in comparison to the options that are out there. In the student sector, that trend started with build to rent. The smartest people then invested in their properties and brought them up to a higher standard, and they've continued to do very well. It's the people who weren't interested in making that effort and responding to the market who got left behind. And I think if the same professionalisation happens in the broader buy-to-let sector, then that can only be a good thing. Because one of the challenges we have at the moment is that the reputation of the whole sector is tarnished by the small number of people who are providing substandard accommodation or breaking the rules, and that causes problems for all of us. It's not something that anyone should panic about or be scared about, and we think it's something that as an industry we should embrace. But even if you don't go that far, certainly there's no cause for going, well, I'm going to get pushed out now, property's not going to work anymore. That's not the case. This is just something you need to be aware of that's going to start having effects in subtle ways over the coming years. So again, thank you so much to Richard for coming and sharing his knowledge with us. Time now to hear a listener success story, and we love when you send these in. And remember, don't be intimidated. Success can be as small as making the decision to invest or going to your first viewing. We love hearing from people at all stages. So whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or as a review, or as an email, or on the forum, however you do it, get your stories in. Just like Charlie, who contacted us on Instagram to say, love the podcast, guys. Keep up the great work. I listen every week and love the show. Over the last few years, I've bought 8 properties, all in Manchester, and met my goal of becoming financially free and leaving my day job. Massive kudos to you both for the amount of hugely valuable content you put out. Best property podcast out there, and 5 stars from me. Well, 5 stars to you, Charlie. Well done. That is super duper impressive. And the fact that you've achieved your goal is so great to hear. So now you've done that, I hope you've celebrated and set yourself an even bigger goal to follow it up with.
So now it's time for Hub Extra, the part of the show where we like to, yes, give you extra. It's a resource that we think you need in your life. And we back this up with our email that hits your inbox every single Friday. If you're not getting that email, well, shame on you. Sign up to the Property Hub for free and you will get that email. And it's brilliant, trust me. So this week we are bringing you a podcast. And it's a podcast that actually makes me feel pretty awful because it's coming to an end and they've been running for 5 years. Now that podcast is called Startup by a company called Gimlet. And the purpose of that podcast at the very beginning was to document their journey about starting their business. And it was brilliant. And it shared their experiences of getting off the ground. For me, it lost its way a little bit because it then started to talk about other businesses and other subjects, and it didn't talk about their own journey. But it's come full circle now because they are ending the podcast because they've been purchased, Rob, and they've been purchased for a significant sum of money by a company we've all heard of, Spotify.
Yeah, Spotify bought Gimlet recently for $340 million. So in less than the time that we've been sitting here every week yakking on about property, they've built a company and sold it to one of the biggest companies in the world for hundreds of millions. Makes me feel a bit unambitious, but well done to them. And in the final series of Startup, the podcast really got back to its best because they went back to telling their own story and they showed you behind the scenes of the actual acquisition, everything around it, like how Spotify got interested, the process of the negotiations, and how they felt after selling. It's the kind of thing that no one else ever documents. So you don't really know what that whole process is like. And hearing behind the scenes of it is really fascinating. Unfortunately, this last season was only 3 episodes because, Rob, I happily would have listened to another 10 on this subject.
Yeah, it's a shame, but it's still worth listening to just to allow that journey to come full circle. So the reason we recommended it this week is you, like us, may have been listening at the beginning and then just switched off. I had actually, and Rob told me to get back onto it and listen to this journey come to a close. So it's a shame they haven't done more, but it's still a fantastic listen. So go and check that out. And also, while you're at it, check us out on Spotify as well. You may subscribe to us through different channels and mediums, but Spotify is one of the easiest ways to consume podcasts. So if you miss us in your podcast feed, you'll pick us up in Spotify. And who doesn't want to see our lovely little faces smiling at you when you open your Spotify app?
So that is us done for this week. And that's the end of our little 2-parter on Build to Rent. Hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. We certainly did. Let us know what you thought and let us know what you want to hear more of. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Property Hub UK. And remember, there's loads more content on our YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube and search Property Hub. We'll be back with another episode, of course, next Thursday. And before that, there's Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. So enjoy your week and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.